And now we invite Dr. Hayleigh Bosher and Kevin Brennan MP, Right Honourable Kevin Brennan, to join us on the screen. So it's with great excitement that I introduce Hayleigh, who's an academic, an IPCAT contributor, an influential blogger, the author of a book and many articles, particularly on the copyright, the music industry, and the law and economics of that. And very, very great pleasure to welcome Kevin Brennan MP, who sponsored the private members bill and has worked tirelessly in committee as well as in the Chamber of Parliament to procure a more equitable future than seems to be the case under the current legislation. So I'm going to hand over to Hayleigh and to Kevin. They'll have a conversation, but we suggest that you can at any time put questions or comments into the chat box, and Hayleigh and Kevin will be able to see your comments, as I think will everyone. And so I will leave it to you, if I may, Hayleigh and Kevin, to decide whether you want to deal with any comments as you go along or save the comments and questions to our discussion session at the end. So welcome. I'll hand over to you and I'll make myself disappear so that you're bigger. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Kevin this evening, and I hope that you all join in. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So yeah, we definitely save some time at the end for questions, but if something comes up along the way, then we might pick up on it if it's relevant to what we're talking about. But we thought we would just do a nice relaxed conversational style discussion around everything that's been going on with the music streaming inquiry, and then talk specifically about Kevin's bill and what it said and what the progress of that is. Okay, so I thought let's go in chronological order. Let's start from the beginning. And if people do follow the IPCAT or IPCAT, some people, I don't know which way is the right way to say it, and I really should. Then, I've been blogging about it a lot, so I've been following the inquiry really closely. And there's so much to say, like we could talk about it all day. And so when I was thinking of questions, I was like, well, things to ask you, Kevin. I was like, well, I know like what happened, but there's stuff that I want to know that I don't know, maybe more like behind the scenes things. So my first question is like, how is it decided that this is something that needs an inquiry in the first place?
Well, as you know, I'm a member, Hayleigh, and thanks for having me, everybody. I'm a member of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. So that's a group of cross-party MPs that are chosen by their parties, and also the chair is elected by MPs from across the House to look into a particular department and do inquiries into issues that are important in that space. And it's quite a wide-ranging group of things, obviously DCMS. But to answer your question, how do we decide what to look into and what inquiries to do? It's entirely up to the committee what they want to do. We're not told by anybody what to do, and so we have private discussions about that. We obviously have a small but very hard-working group of parliamentary clerks who support our work and help us with all of that and with possible suggestions. In this case, I think it's not a secret really that this is something that I was very strongly in favour of us doing, and so I suggested to the committee that this is something we might like to do, to look into the whole issue of the economics of music streaming. And I think the committee were mildly interested in it as a potential topic, because it might be regarded as quite niche, I suppose, in some ways, when there are much broader, wider subjects you could look into that perhaps are more prominent in the news. And our committee does, sometimes feature quite strongly in the news. But I think when we got the inquiry going, it's fair to say that the members of the committee's interest was stimulated by the evidence that we received and by the level of interest that there was in what we were doing. We got over 300, which is very unusual, 300 written submissions, to the committee, and that ranged from submissions from individual well-known artists and bands and so on, to major industry bodies, to academics, to collection agencies, all sorts of people interested in this subject matter. And quite a large number of them were actually confidential, because they were what the committee was quite surprised to find was that there were lots of people in the music industry who were actually afraid to speak out about this subject and their concerns about what they received as remuneration for their recorded music. And so that did stimulate the interest of the committee. And of course, the evidence that we took also stimulated the interest of the committee in relation to the makeup of the industry, the way that people get paid for music when it's streamed, and the competition issues that there are within the music industry. But that's how it comes about, really. It's really the committee itself decides what it wants to look into. And in this case, it was something that I very strongly pushed for.
Right, that makes sense. And I think people probably already know as well that, it started in October 2020, right?
Yeah.
So we were in the midst of the pandemic. And I think that, especially when I've talked to other people about the inquiry and the campaigning around the inquiry from, for example, the Musicians Union and the Ivors Academy and the Broken Record campaign, was that in a way, the pandemic was an opportunity for them to take a step back and think about their revenue streams, especially because lots of revenue streams that they had weren't happening anymore. Like the venues were closed, so there's no collection coming from the communication of the public of their work. Obviously, there was no live music, which is also a huge revenue stream. And so I think I don't know, it's not that COVID happened, so this happened. But I do think that because COVID happened, the kind of emphasis on the issues was made, it became more clear that there was a problem there, or at least there were definitely concerns from large groups of stakeholders within the music industry. So I think that was obviously like part of the momentum, wasn't it, for the inquiry happening?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
That's correct.
Yeah. I was thinking that about but how do you decide? Because you must get lots of people campaigning about lots of things, and there's some things that you take forward and some things that you don't. So that's really interesting to know. And you touched on something else I was really interested in, which is about the engagement, because I've also been involved in a couple of other these kind of inquiry things, and I don't know if it's just because I'm so into this one, but I do feel like there was so much engagement. Like 300 seemed like a lot in terms of the amount of evidence that you reviewed. And I think actually as the inquiry went on, it became more and more prominent in the news. And like you said, people started to realize how this actually affects everybody, because we all listen to music. And then it became something that became of more of a public interest kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you would probably at the outset think this might be a bit dry and technical, looking into copyright regulation and the Copyright Act, Copyright and Patents Designs Act 1988, and how that affects music. It's a potential turn-off immediately, isn't it, for a lot of people, and you certainly don't want to be opening the boot and looking at the wiring too closely if you want to engage people in it. But you're right, the background did include the fact that musicians were not getting paid for their work as live performers, which is a really, really important part of a musician's earnings because of COVID. No festivals. We'd done an inquiry into looking at the impact of all of that and of the government's response to what was happening in the creative industries. So it just shone a spotlight really on the very small amount of money that a lot of musicians were making from the exploitation of their recorded music. and with no live venues open, even with no things like, hairdressers or, shops and things not being open as much, where, they might receive some money if their music's played through the collection societies. All of that left them with very little income from recorded music. And you are right that as the inquiry went on, I think that, a lot from a fan point of view, a lot of people think that they might pay their £10 subscription on a monthly basis to a streaming service and play their favorite artists and listen to their music, and instinctively think that their money will go to those artists, that somehow or other there's a direct process by which they choose to listen to a piece of music, and their subscription therefore will go to the people they like to listen to. And I think people are quite surprised when they find out that's not how it works at all. And that there is very little relationship actually between you as an individual consumer and the music you listen to, and the money that the individual artist receives through the process by which artists are paid for their recorded music. So that surprised a lot of people. And then I think on top of that, the realization, for example, that some artists, particularly those on legacy contracts, so-called, who might have signed a recording contract before streaming existed. And let's be honest, this technology it's only a decade or so that this technology has actually been available for the consumption of music. There was downloading before that, but this is a very, very new technology which now dominates the way that most people listen to recorded music. About 80% of them, well, 70 or 80% of the market, whichever figures you look at. That they're quite surprised to find out you could be someone who was an award-winning artist who made a record 25 years ago, and like Tom Gray, for example, the founder of the Broken Record Campaign, and because of the nature of that contract, the record label say you never recouped on your original record deal, i.e. you never paid the debt for your original advance according to the way that deal was written, that they can stream your music and you don't receive a single penny for that. And that was quite a surprise to people, I think, as well. Even though the record labels no longer have distribution costs, they don't have to manufacture records, they don't have to send them out in lorries to record shops, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think all of that, as we went along, sparked an interest both for members of the committee, but also for the wider public.
Yeah, and I really agree about those 2 points that you've made. I think are two of the biggest revelations for people who maybe didn't know before, which I think was the majority of people, maybe who weren't directly involved in that transaction, that you aren't paying directly. Your monthly subscription doesn't go to the music that necessarily that you're listening to, and that some artists really are earning nothing because of the contracts. I would just say though that, like, as a copyright scholar, the idea of doing an inquiry into copyright never seemed boring to me. Obviously we love it.
Yes, well, you're a rare and special breed.
Yeah, exactly. But also it's interesting, probably I'm speaking also for some of the lawyers in the audience, that everything that's gone on in the inquiry, everything that you've talked about, I'm always viewing it within the framework of from a copyright perspective. And for me, it makes a lot of sense, the whole need for, we'll get onto in a minute the recommendations of the committee and then what your bill said. But in essence, from a copyright perspective, what we're talking about is basically whether copyright is fit for purpose, because the whole point in copyright is to balance the interests of all of the stakeholders involved. So it's inevitable in the way that copyright regulation works, that you are always going to have this kind of balancing act between the rights holders, and that includes people's access to the creativity, the creators themselves, and the disseminators, which is, in this context, the labels and the publishers, but also the platforms. And something that you said earlier is, for me, really the trigger all of this from a copyright perspective, which is about the making available and streaming being the most common way that people consume music now, there or thereabouts. Like you said, there's all this different data and everything. But, there was this European Commission study done, I think it was a long time ago, really, like 2015 even, and they already started to recognize that making available has become the most prominent way that we we consume copyright protected material. And because of that weighting within the bundle of rights that you have in copyright being bigger than all of the other ones, then even on that basis alone, there kind of needs to be a rebalancing of the way that we kind of manage copyright. And one of the big things I think also is surprising for people from a copyright perspective, especially I find like when I'm teaching my students, is the relationship between copyright and contract, and how you can say, these are the copyright rules, these are the basics. And then you can go into an industry and there just is a whole new world. Like it's because you can manage copyright through contracts, you can contract in and out of a lot of the rules that, you know, copyright provides, or the rights and benefits that the copyright provides. You can copyright out, you can contract out of them, like you say, artists and performers on contracts where they're actually receiving nothing. And that's another way that kind of like stumps copyright's ability to, you know, fulfill its purpose. So that's kind of like my thinking about the, you know, the copyright perspective of why we're having this discussion, as well as kind of like what you're saying about the industry perspective. So let's talk about the inquiry, the recommendation report, which again I think was really long and thorough. Really, again, I've seen other ones which are much shorter. That must have been quite a task, and there were quite a lot of recommendations as well. It wasn't you know, one or two. Yeah, there was quite a lot. So I don't know if you just want to quickly mention some of the key ones. I mean, my main question is actually more about the relationship between them, because I mean, again, I'm sure everybody listening knows the main things that were recommended. So we had the Competition Markets Authority, which has moved forward, the Advertising Standards Agency recommendation, and then the stuff relating to what we've been talking about with copyright, which is equitable remuneration for streaming, contract adjustment. I'm trying to remember them all off the top of my head now. Rights revocation.
Yeah.
Lots to do with transparency as well.
Yeah.
So my question is about the recommendations. Like, say those are the key ones. I think I've covered them all.
Yeah, I think you have. Yeah.
Did you, when you're putting forward these recommendations, like, did you think about the relationship between them in terms of like, well, if they take forward recommendation 1, then it doesn't matter that we don't get recommendation 3, or it's just kind of like we want all of these things?
I think we thought of it as a coherent sort of package of recommendations as a committee. And what we were trying to do, I think, was to actually, you know, to do a very serious piece of work. So we did take evidence over several months. We had lots and lots of oral hearings, as I know were followed very closely by lots of people interested in copyright and in music more broadly. And we had those very extensive written submissions. But I think as a committee, we thought that this was an opportunity to bring forward, you know, a pretty comprehensive series of recommendations that form a package. Now, obviously, you could implement some and not others. That is possible. But we thought that generally the thrust of what we were recommending is the way to fix streaming, for want of a better phrase, to use the hashtag that was used by the Musicians Union and the Ivors Academy. And why those particular recommendations and how they relate to each other? Well, you mentioned about the competition issues. So for those who aren't aware, the music industry, the recorded music industry, is largely dominated by 3 very major, they're called the majors, but 3 huge, you know, foreign-owned corporations. We don't really have a big, huge, you know, UK-based record labels anymore. The 3 biggies, you know, Universal Music Group, Sony and Warner, and they dominate the market. And I think what surprised perhaps some members of the committee was they not only dominate the market on the recorded side, you know, where copyright lies, but also on the publishing side, you know, on the song side, if you like to use a more colloquial expression. And the committee strongly felt that there were elements here that suggested there's the potential, at the very least, for cartel-like behaviour and for an oligopolistic market existing, and for the actions of the majors not necessarily to be in the interests of all parts of those they're representing in their business. For example, there's there's a strong reason, because it's more profitable for them to favor the recording over the song, then, you know, there's an incentive potentially, even though they say they do these things separately, for them to lean in much more to wanting the recording to have a bigger share of the royalty pot from streaming revenues. And we recommended, obviously, that's something the Competition Authority should be looking into. And the government agreed with that. They've already implemented that recommendation, that they should be referred to the Competition and Markets Authority for a market study to see whether there was anything in those fees and whether there needed to be some competition recommendations in relation to that. So that recommendation is actually already, that's a very, very significant step forward, that inquiry is taking place. On the other issues, the issue of equitable remuneration, we felt that the evidence from the inquiry, you know, suggested really that the way that making available of music is treated within streaming, and has been treated, I think I'm right in saying, since WIPO looked into this back in the early 2000s, the World Intellectual Property Organization, has been treated, you know, as if you are doing something that's equivalent to a sale, that you're like buying a piece of music and playing it, so it's being made available to you and you're consuming it. Whereas in fact, streaming has features which are hybrid, really. Sometimes you go onto a streaming service and you pick somebody you want to listen to because you love their music, or you want to discover their new record and so on. But at other times it plays to you via an algorithm in a way that's a bit more akin to radio play. And of course, under radio play, you are entitled, if you're a performer, under the Copyright Act, to give it a short title, you are entitled to a payment known as equitable remuneration. So you do get an unwaivable payment by right if your music is played. And if it is the case that streaming is gradually replacing radio or taking over from radio, as is the stated aim of Spotify, as they made clear, you know, in their corporate communications and in evidence to the committee, if that is their ambition and they're succeeding in taking away, you know, radio play, or taking over from radio play, then an obvious conclusion from that is ultimately musicians will earn less from equitable remuneration if that process continues. And so we felt there was a justification to introduce that concept into streaming as well, and for there to be an unwaivable payment of that kind. And then we also felt on the contract side that there was a strong case for reform, because the nature of the sorts of you know, traditional recording contracts that many people signed really are not suitable for the modern streaming age. And the idea that you sign away your rights for life of copyright, which is your life effectively plus, in this day and age, without any right to review that contract, seems a very, very archaic form. I mean, you know, you can get divorced these days. You know, you're supposed to get married for life. That's true, but you know, that you should be able to, if you're dissatisfied with the way that your rights are being exploited and what you're getting from the bargain, you should be able to, after a significant period of time and giving due notice, be able to reclaim your rights and assign them to someone else, or exploit them yourself if you think you can do a better job. And also, if you've signed something early on in your career about a piece of music you've composed, and it later turns out you're getting a tiny proportion of the value that it eventually gets, that you should be able to, you know, say, I think I should be paid more for that, and that can be adjudicated by an independent body like the Copyright Tribunal. And finally, we also, I think finally, I might have left something up, but we also felt it was really important that we put into regulation the requirement for transparency, because, you know, there were very, very significant complaints throughout, particularly from songwriters and composers, that they find it difficult to find out where and exactly how their work's being exploited, and that therefore there should be a transparency requirement on those who are exploiting their work.
Yeah, well, it really makes sense that the transparency requirements kind of feed into the other things that you've just said about contract adjustment and rights revocation, because, you know, in order to be involved in that process of the management of your copyright, you need to have information about what the value of your work is and whether it's being exploited and how much for. So that really makes sense to me, the connection that you do need the transparency, as if you're going to have the other two as well. So that makes sense. So let's go to back to what you were saying about equitable remuneration for streaming. So as you said, the equitable remuneration currently exists already under copyright law for for communication to the public, excluding making available the one where it's like in a place and time chosen by them. So therefore, if you choose to listen to it yourself on your Spotify or Apple Music, it doesn't apply. And you know, when I was looking into this from like an academic perspective, I was researching about like the legal conceptual justifications for when we should have equitable remuneration. And again, it came down to it's a legal concept that's there to rebalance the rights of the stakeholders, the creator and the disseminator, where the disseminator has power, or so the creator has a weakened bargaining power, or where the market won't function without this right. So, you know, when we excluded making available from equitable remuneration, that decision was taken at a different time. Like before, as we said, streaming is now more and will probably carry on in that direction, becoming more of the way that we consume music, and radio becoming less. So from a legal point of view, it kind of makes sense to me, like to extend. Do you see what I mean? Like what I hear what you're saying about streaming as like radio, which is like, you know, the practical perspective. From a legal perspective, it also makes sense to me that the equitable remuneration is extended where it's the market isn't functioning and that the creator has a weakening bargaining power and isn't fairly remunerated. When you see such disparity, it's not that, you know, the record labels seem to be doing okay. You know, there's also this sideline argument of some people saying like we need to increase the size of the pie. I've heard this a lot. And I don't disagree. You know, it's actually the 20th anniversary of the $9.99 for Spotify this month. I can't remember the exact date. So it's been 20 years since.
It can't be 20 years. Spotify hasn't been around for 20 years, is it? It must be. Yeah, but it's certainly been around for over a decade. Yeah,
long time. And it's also the same price everywhere. So it's about the $9.99. It's not, the value is different, right, depending on the currency. And you know, I do agree, and they would argue, right, that they're competing with YouTube and free, and I don't think that's an invalid argument. But at the same time, it's about the disparity, isn't it? When you see the headlines of like that guy earning 150 million and more than all the songwriters put together from streaming in a whole year. I mean, that's just wild. So yeah, I was just saying from the ER for streaming from a legal perspective also makes sense. And the thing that people found interesting about this is that for ER to operate, you can't have both the exclusive right and the equitable remuneration. You have to have one or the other. And so moving on to how it's presented in your bill, it applies where the rights have been transferred, which enables the equitable remuneration to apply, and also I think is useful for independent artists.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, you know, there's a lot of talk in the debate about my bill, as it always is about every bill, to be honest with you, about unintended consequences, because, you know, there's an old saying, legislate in haste and repent at, you know, your peril. But, you know, I was trying to argue this isn't a hasty sort of dash down piece of legislation that I was proposing. It's actually based on a very thorough inquiry and on evidence, and has been thought through and you know, it may not be perfectly drafted, but, you know, government bills are not perfectly drafted either. You know, as they go along their parliamentary journey, they can be tweaked and improved and so on. But the intentions are what's important, and then you can always tweak the bill to meet those intentions. And it's certainly not the intention of my bill to impact on, you know, independent releasing artists who are you're not assigning the rights to someone else. I mean, you don't, you know, it'd be daft if they were collecting equitable remuneration in order to pay it to themselves or whatever. So that's the reason for that exclusion, and it was specifically to ensure that people who have assigned their rights do have this unwaivable right, you know, to a payment. And conceptually, you know, I'm not saying that streaming is radio, because it isn't. But neither is it, as the record labels argue, a sale, effectively. Clearly it is something new and different, and it's no good pointing at a cow and saying it's a horse, which is what the record labels sort of do. I mean, it's a different creature from what was there previously. And I think the law does need to be updated to reflect the reality of that, if equitable remuneration is to still be a valuable source, small but valuable source of income to musicians, to complement the other income which we've talked about, which they've lost a lot of during the last couple of years, and which has highlighted the need for this.
Well, absolutely. And I think that, especially from a copyright perspective, we always update copyright law to adapt to new technologies. It has to. That's the whole point. We have new laws every time something was invented, whether it be the photocopier or a camera or the internet.
Or even even records in the first place. I mean, originally musicians were told, you just sing into this thing here, and we'll take care of the rest. And here's $10, and you might find you're better known when you go out there and play around, and that should be enough reward for you. And of course, that was one new technology. Suddenly people realized, hang on a minute, some people are making millions out of this. Where's my bit? I'm the actual person who created this noise that people love to hear, and it's now being reproduced everywhere. And of course, this is just an extension of a century or more old development of the law to be able to make sure that when somebody's work is copied, that they get a fair remuneration for that.
Yeah, and on that point about the creators, so going back to the rights revocation, so in the inquiry recommendations and in your bill, you're looking to enable creators to get their rights back after 20 years. So I don't know if you just wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of motivation behind that, and also in particular, was there a reason why you picked 20? Or
in the bill, the reason I picked 20 was because that's what we recommended in the report. And it is true that we did pick a time scale that is shorter than perhaps in some other jurisdictions. I think in the United States a similar provision exists, which is 35 years. 20 years seemed to be a reasonable length of time to give to somebody who wants to invest in an artist's work in order to exploit their work, for them to actually do that, and to have a reasonable chance of exploiting their work within that period. So it seemed to us that is like a generation, isn't it? 20 years. That was a reasonable period of time. But it is arguable if someone were to make an argument that it ought to be a slightly different figure. But the record labels themselves, of course, are completely against any revocation of rights, whatsoever. They think it should be life of copyright. But these sorts of record deals have become more common now. I mean, quite a lot of independent labels actually, do 15-year deals and things like that. The reason for it, essentially, is to do two things. One is to encourage better records, better contracts in the first place, because you want, if you want to keep on exploiting an artist's work, you've got to be proving to them that you are actually not just taking the money and doing nothing, that you are actually working hard to make sure that by exploiting their rights, the artist is getting well paid. And secondly, to allow artists, after a period of time, if they're dissatisfied with the way in which their work is being exploited, to be able to reclaim it back and do a better job themselves, or give it to somebody else to do a better job. And I certainly think, from a point of view of justice, I don't necessarily start from the position of copyright. I tend to start from the position of, what's fair here. That if somebody made a record a long time ago, and it might have lain dormant for many years because it was actually not being released at all. It probably wasn't available on that. It might have been listed in the catalogue, but was not available for purchase, and that artist would have been making nothing of it. All of a sudden, it's posted up on a streaming service, and you get nothing because of a contract you signed 30 years ago, before the technology that enables it to be put on that platform existed. That seems, in just by a kind of natural sense of justice, to be very, very unfair. You ought to be able to, unless they're offering you a decent cut, you ought to be able to say, right, I want to take my rights elsewhere. And there was an interesting recent case, a UK recording artist called Fortet, who is in dispute with their record label for a contract signed before streaming existed. Lawyers get involved. It could end up in court. What does the record label do? Apparently, on legal advice, they pull all that artist's music off the streaming service so no one can listen to it. And which is an extraordinary state of affairs. Whereas, and if my bill were in place, that artist could say, okay, if you don't give me, some more for my music being streamed, I'm taking my ball somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case. I'm following closely to see what happens there. And you're right. I think first of all, about the number. I mean, I'm just interested because there are different amount of time in different jurisdictions. So in America, it's 35 years. In Canada, they have one where 25 years after the death of the creator, and it's also automatic, whereas the one that you've proposed is like similar to the American one where you apply to have your rights back. And I think that's helpful for the labels because their main argument appears to be that gives that lack of certainty. They don't know how long they're going to have the rights for. I suppose in some ways, if it's an automatic reserve, you know that it's going in 20 years. But at the same time, if you apply within the time, then they're given notice. It's not completely just out of the blue one day you take it back.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember my own bill now. I think it's 2 years effectively, the notice that you have to give. So, that's a reasonable length of time. They're not suddenly cutting everything off. And I would assume that what would happen in the lead up to that time is the record labels would be engaging much more meaningfully with artists to talk about the next period of that contract.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is definitely touching on like a global conversation because there are lots of campaigns going on from literally Australia to Canada about rights revocation and because there are also lots of other things that it impacts, like orphan works, works that, like you're saying, works that are lost or not being used, not being exploited. It gives the creator the chance to take it elsewhere if that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, and that's another point actually, Hayleigh. One of the things that came up quite a lot is this issue of industry black boxes in the which for those who may not know, there are pots of money which no one knows how to assign them because the records are not good enough, or they don't know who the ultimate rights holder is, or they can't find the artist, or whatever reason there is, or they're not trying hard enough. But for whatever reason there is, and what's done with that money is a very interesting point of view. Number one, it should be minimized, and part of the shining the light on information is to do that. But secondly, if there are orphan works or money that can't easily be assigned, what should be done with that money? And currently there are various approaches to that. My own view is that it should be put to good use for the next generation of music makers.
Agreed. And I also think, touching on what someone said in the chat as well, with the contract adjustment, I think one of the things, and ironically, I think this is one of the arguments that people say against legislating on this, is that, copyright needs to always keep up with technology. And if we legislate, then maybe we'll legislate for this exact problem. And then in 10 years, there'll be another problem and the law won't be relevant anymore. But I think that we try to legislate in a way that's, well, the idea is to legislate in a way that's not too technologically specific, and so that you can kind of be future facing. And I'm just wondering about the future of music consumption, whether these kind of things would actually be useful, because like you said, at the minute, one of the problems is that the contracts don't cover streaming at all, and therefore creators aren't being remunerated at all. And so I think that argument about one of the reasons not to legislate might be that the law won't keep up to date with technology. I just think actually you can turn that on the head and say, well, no, this is a kind of a backdoor for when that problem occurs. It would enable creators to go back to their label and be like, well, now that this has happened.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think originally the WIPO changes that were made were meant to be technologically neutral in the sense that they were looking forward to the fact that digital music was and peer-to-peer sharing, all that was coming in, and it was likely that it was going to develop new different types of platforms, as has happened. But in a sense, what it didn't anticipate was, of course, that the definitions within the previous law, of making available and communicating to the public and so on, wouldn't quite fit the technology that emerged. So in a sense, my bill is trying to sort of future-proof that a little bit, and not to be so specific as to make it impossible that it couldn't work into the future. But as you said earlier, you're always going to need to tweak these things, but making the law as open as possible. So I don't specify in the bill how much should be paid in equitable remuneration. It builds on current copyright law. It isn't a completely new departure. It's definitely an attempt to evolve, the current law that we have. And, it allows for a great degree of negotiation to take place, and for there to be a mechanism for disputes to be resolved by the Copyright Tribunal, which I think is really important. But I think one argument that was deployed, not many people actually argued that the bill, that point that the bill, was a bit too tech specific, so it wouldn't last and so on. But one argument that I found quite astonishing from some of the record labels was that, well, if you introduced equitable remuneration, we just adjust our contracts to pay our artists less, in their contracts as a result. Now that is an astonishing sort of admission of everything that's wrong, in the music industry, if you like, because we're talking here about a small sum of money via equitable remuneration, which, yes, this is meant to redistribute, revenue from the supernormal profits being made by these big sort of industry leaders into the pockets of the creators. A small redistribution, even in an industry which, as you said, through the recent universal sort of public offering, where the chairman and CEO, who holds both posts simultaneously, gets a payout, we're told in the industry press, of £153 million this year. More than everything earned by every songwriter and composer in the UK from streaming. That if the answer is, well, if equitable remuneration is introduced, we just basically pay musicians less through their recording contracts, then I think, it's no wonder that the Competition and Markets Authority are interested in looking into the competition in the industry.
Well, exactly. And I also think that also touches on the point we were talking about earlier about the relationship between these different kind of clauses in your bill, in that even more so then do we need the contract adjustment and the rights revocation and the transparency, because if that's their attitude, then there needs to be ways to kind of ensure that
Yeah.
it reaches its goal, isn't it?
Yeah, and on top of that, I think one thing that people sometimes forget about legislation is that ultimately, when it is adjudicated, very often the first thing you should look at is, what was Parliament's intention here? What was the intention? And in this instance, the intention would clearly be, were my bill to become law, Parliament's clear intention would be that there should be an additional payment that would come to musicians through equitable remuneration. And in any adjudication through the Copyright Tribunal as a result of any disputes, I think it would be absolutely clear that if that wasn't happening, then the Copyright Tribunal would have every right to rule in favour of the musician in that instance. And so I think making very clear in debate in Parliament through different debates and committee stages and so on what the intention is the important part there.
I agree. I was getting quite frustrated when I was watching the debate on Friday. Some people saying about the unintended consequences, and I'm like, pretty sure that's an intended consequence. that's not unintended. Absolutely. So I'm conscious of time, so I just want to talk specifically about the bill. So it was debated in Parliament on Friday. Where are we at now with what's happening?
Okay, so my bill, it had what's called its second reading, but what it didn't do was pass through to the next stage. So it's kind of in a sort of a queue, which it'll never get out of unless the government allows it to. So in effect, the government does obviously have a majority and controls the votes in the House of Commons. So legislation can't pass through unless it gives it the all clear. And it made it clear, in fairness, it did make it clear to me that in advance and during the debate that they accepted that there was a problem. that there is a problem here and that needs to be addressed, that it would prefer for the industry to bring forward solutions to that problem. That would be its preference, which is interesting because I don't think the industry accepts there is a problem. So the fact that the government accepts there's a problem is very important, and that it would be prepared to legislate if that wasn't, if action from the industry wasn't forthcoming, and also that in addition to that, it was carrying out a series of pieces of work which it outlined in the debate. You can read about that in Hansard and so on, or on the TCMS and BEIS websites, and through the IPO and other organisations and ad hoc bodies that it's brought together from the industry to actually look at the whole issue of creator earnings and the impact of streaming and so on, and to look at the evidence for it, because the government, its view is that the evidence is not yet sufficient for it to justify legislation at this point. So it might be that the government might in due course bring something forward very similar to my bill, or something very different, or it might not agree to, but it has agreed to complete that work and report back on it by September of next year. So the fact that my bill didn't pass on to the committee stage, which was where it would have been scrutinised further and then gone on to the House of Lords and so on for scrutiny there, and therefore is stuck for the moment, doesn't mean that the campaign doesn't go on and that the bill and the proposals within it don't remain relevant. And there's an ongoing process happening which should land at some point during next year by September.
Great. Well, I'm sure everybody here, and myself included, are following very closely what will be happening, and I'll be really interested to see the outcome of the research and the stakeholder groups, like you mentioned. And I think it's like you said, the fact that the government recognised that there is an issue is obviously huge for like you said, the intention of the bill, and I think we're in a room full of mostly lawyers, so people will have their own views about whether legislation is the right way forward or not. And I think that, whether my reservation with the stakeholder groups is that, the industry argument for not legislating is also a bit like, well, you don't understand how complicated it is, and it takes a really long time for legislation to happen. And that, and I'm like, yeah, but your current business model is from centuries old.
Yeah.
So
the standard industry response is to exaggerate and patronize. I think usually anybody who suggests there might be something needs to be done and then try and bamboozle you, whether you're an artist or anybody else, with bright lights and promises. And I think people should stand up and say, look, enough is enough. We are intelligent human beings. We can understand. We can see what's going on here, and there's an issue and it needs to be dealt with.
And like you said, you did a lot of work. There was a lot of evidence. It was a very comprehensive recommendation document. And I think that to say that at this point is lost on me, to be honest. But,
worth reading if you haven't yet.
Yeah, there you go.
Available online.
So we have a few minutes left if anybody in the audience wants to ask a question. Somebody has already asked about the role of CMOs in the discourse on this. There was evidence, wasn't there, from, I watched the one with PRS as well. So was there anything particularly, my view is that the CMOs are there to transaction the things that we're discussing rather than having a specific interest in it. But I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously they're complicated, sort of stakeholder organizations themselves, because they're membership organizations. So, musicians are, represented through something like PRS for music and so on, but also, indirectly through the publishers and so on, who are owned largely by the majors and so on. The sort of major record label interests are indirectly represented through the major publishers. So there are issues in governance and so on in relation to things like the CMOs. However, for our purposes, they exist and are important to be there to be able to collect and distribute to the members who have rights that are lodged with them the revenues that they're entitled to, and then it's, I think, up to the members to hold those organisations to account for their administration costs and etc. etc. But for our purposes, the key thing was that they would be a vehicle by which these monies could be paid out.
Yeah, exactly. So the equitable remuneration, how it already works is through the collecting society, and it's the same with the bill, isn't it?
EPL and so on. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's for the rights.
That was the proposal.
Yeah. Shavana asked about
non-fungible tokens.
All into this is like we could do a whole nother webinar on this, I suppose.
I think this probably is a whole other webinar, isn't it? And I mean, the getting your head conceptually around this is quite an interesting sort of process, isn't it? And the idea that you have a unique kind of digital thing, whatever it is, a work of art, a piece of music, a package of things that an artist created, that you own the non-replicable version of. I think this is going to be obviously, play a big role in the way that artists make their living in the digital age, the ability to be able to monetize and sell something that's digital, which in theory could be easily replicable, but if you can put a sort of digital what's the thing you put on a piece of gold, we call that hallmark, isn't it? It's almost like a digital hallmark in a way, that then you can, and clearly there's a huge market developing for this sort of thing, and people are paying huge sums of money for that unique digital experience. For someone like me, from who grew up in the analog age, it's conceptually quite a difficult thing to get your head around, but I'm sure it is going to be an important part of the ecosystem going forward for the creative industries.
And I also think from a copyright perspective, it's a growing area of heated debate about whether copyright even applies to an NFT or whether it should. I'm also currently working on a paper where we're discussing the idea of payments that are made when the NFT is resold, and whether the copyright holder of the original work should be entitled to that, because that's something that's happening through the platforms, which they're deciding to. Some platforms are doing it and some platforms aren't, whether from a copyright perspective. But then some people will just turn around and say, no, this is not even a copyright issue. So I think it might be potentially the next big copyright debate. And as you said, I think in something that it might also be big for the industry as well.
I think I'll pass the ball on to someone else on that one, though.
May I just mention that, in fact, one of our members has asked whether we could have a meeting on non-fungible tokens. So it's clearly exercising people's minds, and maybe we can lure you back, Hayleigh, on another occasion or two.
It's also something, I went to a music industry conference a while ago, and they had a whole panel on it. So it's I think, a growing area of interest.
Well, wow, you've given us such a treat. I think we've answered all the questions that have come through so far. Thank you very much for mentioning Tom Gray's contributions. We had hoped that he might be able to join us, but sadly that didn't prove possible. I think it remains for me to thank you tremendously, and also thank you that you've agreed for this to be recorded so that we can share it more widely with our friends. I know we've got some friends from overseas and international organisations who have joined us, and I'm sure everyone will be watching very, very carefully at the next stages. But can I ask a quick question? We've got the government continuing investigations or evidence gathering, and we've got the Competition and Markets Authority. And you mentioned that the government would, September was the target for reporting. Is the CMA, market investigation likely to take much longer or the same time or much shorter Do you know?
They're independent once they do this, so they can operate to their own timetable. That question was asked actually during the debate, in the second reading debate, and I think ministers made it clear that they can't dictate that. So, but you can these things don't happen super quickly, but they should do it in a timely fashion. I think the government's timetable on this is quite an important part of the consideration the Competition and Markets Authority should take into account in doing this work. But we can't give you an exact date. I mean, unusual for the government actually to say September, because usually they'll be much vaguer than that. They'll say autumn, but in government terms, autumn probably lasts until New Year's Eve. So so they were clearer. So we'll try to hold them to account on that timetable.
I think everything's moving comparably quite fast. I mean, I did my PhD on the CDPA, and that took decades. So I think by comparison, things are moving very quickly, even in terms of when they said we're going to start implementing the stakeholder groups and the research, and it's already commissioned, it's already happening. So I think they're moving really fast. And I also know that in the CMA statement about undertaking the study, they said that they are treating it as a priority, and it's the first one that they're working on. So I think also that we won't be waiting long necessarily, but then
lots to look forward to. Well, thank you again so much. We can't give you the proper applause. There doesn't seem to be a button for people to go do those little symbols like there is on Zoom, but I know all our delegates will be keen to express their appreciation. Thank you so much. Oh, Maria Mercedes has found the button.
There we are.
Thanks.
So
Thank you.
the thanks
Thank
are
you.
flooding in. We'll end the seminar now and look forward to more debates in the future.
Thanks,
Thank you
Kevin. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Hayleigh. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.